Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Wednesday, the 2nd of October here in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Israel vows to retaliate after Iran launches a ballistic missile attack on the country. We have the latest on this developing story.
Vice presidential candidates Vance and Walz clash on immigration and abortion with just 5 weeks to go until US voters cast their ballots.
Plus, Chinese stocks soar again. Hong Kong traders returned from a public holiday to more stimulus-induced euphoria.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Israel has vowed to retaliate after Iran attacked the country with ballistic missiles in a sharp escalation between the Middle Eastern adversaries. The strike involved around 200 missiles, which Israel said it mostly intercepted, with one person reportedly killed in the West Bank. The Iranian reprisal follows the decision by Israel to send ground forces across the border into Lebanon and the killing of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah in a Beirut airstrike last week. The US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan says they will also respond.
We are proud of the actions that we've taken alongside Israel to protect and defend Israel. We have made clear that there will be consequences, severe consequences for this attack, and we will work with Israel to make that the case.
Jake Sullivan there. The European Union said in a statement that successive waves of attacks and retaliations have been fueling an uncontrollable spiral of conflict. Iran's foreign minister spoke to his British, French and German counterparts in separate phone calls, warning against any third party intervening in this conflict, according to a telegram post by Iran's foreign ministry.
The latest Iranian strike came with minimal warning, which was in contrast to April's attack, which was telegraphed well in advance and involved slower moving missiles and drones. Tehran's decision to launch another direct attack on Israel has raised the prospect of an escalatory series of tit-for-tat reprisals between the two sides. The UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer says he is deeply concerned.
I utterly condemn this attempt by the Iranian regime to harm innocent Israelis, to escalate this incredibly dangerous situation and push the region ever closer to the brink.
Starmer's comments come after the UK Ministry of Defence confirmed that British military forces had been involved in the efforts to counter the strike from Iran. This morning we're also getting reports that Hezbollah says that its forces have clashed with Israeli soldiers in a village in southern Lebanon. The confrontation marks the latest escalation of Israel's weeks-long campaign against the Iran-backed militant group and will further add to concerns from Western and Arab nations over a wider Middle East conflict.
Oil prices are extending their surge into a second day following Iran's strike on Israel. The global benchmark Brent crude climbed above $74 a barrel after briefly spiking by more than 5% on Tuesday. The continued advance reflects concern that regional hostilities could disrupt supplies, especially given the Middle East accounts for around a third of global supplies. Torbjorn Tornqvist, the chair of oil trading company Gunvor Group, says uncertainty drives profit in the sector.
So, of course, in times of turbulence and drastically changing arbitrage and prices and so forth, there's no secret, you know it yourself, that oil trading companies done extremely well.
Gunvor's Torbjorn Tornqvist there speaking at the Energy Markets Forum to Bloomberg's Germana Bersecci. Haven assets, including bonds, gold and the US dollar, have also climbed since the conflict's latest escalation.
US vice presidential nominees J.D. Vance and Tim Walz have met for their first and potentially only debate before November's US election. The two clashed over abortion, immigration and the Middle East during the televised event.
That's one of the things that Donald Trump and I are endeavoring to do. I want us as a Republican Party to be pro-family in the fullest sense of the word.
Donald Trump put this all into motion. He brags about how great it was that he put the judges in and overturned Roe versus Wade. 52 years of personal autonomy.
J.D. Vance and Tim Walz there discussing abortion rules in the US during that debate there. Recent polls show a close contest with 5 weeks to go before Election Day, a September Bloomberg News Morning Consult poll of swing states found Harris ahead of Trump by 50% to 47% among likely voters.
Chinese shares listed in Hong Kong have jumped the most in almost 2 years as traders returned from a public holiday. The Hang Seng China Enterprises Index climbed at one point by more than 8% as property developers led the gains on a winning streak, with the sector leaping by an inter-day record of more than 30%. The extended rally comes off the back of increased optimism around China's economy after authorities unveiled a range of stimulus measures last week that included interest rate cuts, freeing up of cash for banks and liquidity support for stocks.
France is delaying its plan to meet the 3% EU deficit limit. Speaking during his first parliamentary address, the Prime Minister, Michel Barnier, said the country will aim to meet the target by 2029 instead of 2027 through tax hikes and spending cuts.
We want the effort to be shared collectively and will request participation from very large companies which make significant profits. We will do this without calling into question our competitiveness. We'll also ask for an exceptional contribution from the wealthiest French people to avoid tax exemption strategies. Finally, we will fight against tax and social fraud.
Prime Minister Michel Barnier speaking there via a translator. He also said that France's deficit is set to expand beyond 6% this year and the situation would worsen further without action. In response to the plans, the leader of the far-right National Rally, Marine Le Pen, indicated that her party would not support an expected no-confidence motion in the new Prime Minister and urged the administration to transform Barnier's intentions into action.
The UK's Prime Minister Keir Starmer is heading to Brussels in an attempt to reset relations with the European Union. Ahead of his meeting with Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, Bloomberg has learned that the two parties are looking to hold their first formal bilateral summit next year. James Woolcock has more.
The British government wants a better deal on defence and fewer checks on food. The EU wants cooperation on energy and fishing. But can the two succeed where many previous Brexit talks have failed? The new Labour government has made improving ties with Europe a campaigning slogan, but privately, EU officials say they are frustrated by the lack of detail in their plans so far. In Birmingham, James Woolcock, Bloomberg Radio.
We're starting our reporting this morning in the Middle East after yesterday's missile attacks on Israel. We do have a piece looking at Israel's air defences, which I'd recommend. They include, of course, Iron Dome, which many of us know that intercepts around 90% of projectiles, but also other systems called David's Sling and Arrow. And our Quick Take article looks at the effectiveness of these multi-billion-dollar systems and also how Israel's planning a new one to catch projectiles that are fired at close range. So you'll find this piece on Bloomberg.com and on the terminal, the air defences Israel uses against Iran's missiles.
Now let's focus then on the fallout from the attack after Iran fired around 200 ballistic missiles at Israel. How will Israel respond? Bloomberg's reporter Dan Williams joins us now from Jerusalem for more on this. Dan, good morning. How did the attack play out in Israel? Did the air defences hold? They appeared to have held.
Indeed, it was a very dramatic half hour or so throughout the country. It was not telegraphed in advance the way the April attack by Iran was. However, Israelis had about 2 hours to prepare, given that the United States put out a warning that it had findings, not clear from where or how, that the Iranians were preparing a ballistic missile attack. Then the Israelis put out a public alert on their citizens to remain near shelters to avoid congregating in public. And then toward evening, the attack unfolded over about half an hour throughout the country. Now, what was extraordinary here was it literally was a nationwide alert, not just because of potential missile impacts, but potential fallout, debris from successful interceptions. It's worth remembering that unlike in April, when just around a third of those 300 projectiles were ballistic missiles, this time it appears to have been exclusively a ballistic missile salvo of around 180, 200 of these very high-speed, high-altitude, high-payload projectiles. Now, Israel has an upper-tier interceptor system to which you alluded, Arrow, designed to intercept at very high altitude, including in space. But that obviously means that the debris from a successful shoot down can scatter far and wide, dangerously, potentially lethally. So this really was a nationwide alert. Israelis appear to have sheltered appropriately. According to Israel, there is limited casualties. There has been some structural damage. As you noted, there was one fatality, a Palestinian in the West Bank. But certainly this was a jarring episode, an extraordinary day in an already extraordinary year since this war began in October 7th, 2023.
Dan, what has Israel said it will do in response?
It is not said explicitly. It has said, everyone from the Prime Minister to the Defense Minister to the Foreign Minister, that there will be a direct response, meaning Iran attacked Israel, therefore Israel will attack Iran. If one is to pass the statement, the first public remarks Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, made yesterday at a sitting of his security cabinet to discuss this development, he actually appeared to threaten the Iranian regime, the Iranian leadership. He invoked Israel's recent killing of Hezbollah and Hamas leaders, so that's potentially a personal threat against senior Iranian figures. He also made sure to be photographed sitting next to the chief of his foreign intelligence service, the Mossad spy service, which is widely believed to have assassinated a Hamas leader in Tehran just a few weeks ago. So it appears that there is signaling here. Perhaps this is meant to lower the Iranians' guards while the Israelis work on a different type of retaliation, but it appears to be signaling that this will be painful and personal and imminent.
The US has ordered military aid to shore up Israel's defences, and you heard some of what the US has said in response. We also heard from President Biden. Are there any moves on the diplomatic front to calm tensions? We're also talking about the concerns that the EU has.
Potentially, but these, given the rather awkward diplomatic architecture in the Middle East, given that Israel is facing foes that are ideologically committed to its destruction and therefore do not talk to it, this always makes it rather difficult to broker any sort of ceasefire. Of course, a peace agreement is out of the question. So it's very possible that behind the scenes, perhaps through Switzerland, perhaps through Oman, there is urgent messaging to Iran to back off, to the Israelis to back off potentially. But the rhetoric, as you noted from Washington, is pretty much in concert with what we're hearing from Israel. I think you had the National Security Advisor talking about severe consequences for Iran. And it's worth noting that on a smaller but nonetheless significant front, the Lebanese front, Israel has now told its own people and the Lebanese and Hezbollah and the world that it has lost patience with diplomatic solutions for ending Hezbollah attacks on its turf, which has displaced something like 60,000 of its citizens. Hezbollah started attacking Israel a day after Hamas launched this war from Gaza. And since then, we've had repeated calls by Israel on Hezbollah, on the Lebanese, to rein in Hezbollah, a backing off. Israel has supported diplomatic efforts by the United States, by France, to work out a deal whereby Hezbollah consensually backs down and backs off. Over the last 3 weeks, we've basically seen Israel saying to everyone, it's all over. And there's been a cascade of extraordinary and apparently very successful strikes in various forms against Hezbollah, culminating yesterday with what appear to be fairly large-scale ground incursions to dislodge the guerrillas from southern Lebanon through direct action by Israel's ground forces.
But Dan, with that military effort continuing in Lebanon, of course, fighting too in Gaza, and now an attack by Iran, is this stretching Israel's military?
It certainly is, and there will be obviously a fiscal impact. We're already hearing about it from the finance minister. However, Israel said from the outset of this war, a war that blindsided it, but from which it appeared to have recovered fairly quickly within days, that this would be a conflict that could stretch many months, that could impact several fronts, and indeed we've seen fighting on as many as 7 fronts. It has apparently managed to parcel out the conflict such that it avoided entering full fighting with Hezbollah initially, while it focused its efforts on Hamas in the Gaza Strip. It now appears to have Hamas firmly on the ropes, and it appears now to be able to free up its troops for Lebanon on the ground and its air forces, its standoff assets for enemies as far away as Iran, in Yemen, and in Syria. So it appears the Israelis have planned for the long term and have apportioned their resources accordingly.
Dan, just very briefly and finally, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is a deeply divisive figure. What is the sentiment in Israel around Netanyahu and the government currently?
That's an excellent question. Following the assassination last week of the Hezbollah leader in Beirut, which came on the heels of really remarkable, heavy, but nonetheless precise air barrages in Lebanon, and indeed days before that, quite an extraordinary succession of gadget sabotage, the blowing up of beepers and walkie-talkies used primarily by an upper echelon of Hezbollah commanders. I think there is a sense in Israel that their country has now regained the initiative in this war. There's a sense of increased optimism, and that obviously amounts to a higher approval rate for the Prime Minister himself. It appears he is improved in the polls, but he's not yet on the home stretch.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.